Hi everybody, and welcome back to Sketch to See. Lately I've been bringing you some episodes featuring a close to finished yacht, and I'm very excited to be able to do so. But with being away from the channel for so long over the last couple years, there's a fair bit about the construction and some of the circumstances surrounding the build that I've glossed over or missed altogether. Along with the current progress, I'm going to do my best over the next few weeks to fill in the blanks and answer some questions that we have received over the last year or two. So, getting started, COVID was obviously something in the forefront for everyone since 2020 until pretty recently, and some of you have reached out and asked how COVID has affected our timeline and our overall build thus far. I felt like this was an interesting question as COVID is something that has had immediate effects on all of us, but it has also been something new to navigate in terms of being involved in a large-scale project from a distance. So that is what this video is all about. Stay tuned to see what we had to do differently to accommodate this pandemic. Before I get started, I just wanted to give you all a little reminder that you can subscribe to our channel and follow us on Instagram and Facebook. I really enjoy making these videos, and we do all of the filming and editing ourselves, so it goes a long way for us to have you join in and follow along. Now, full disclosure, I initially wrote my thoughts down for this episode in 2021. Things have obviously changed a lot since then, so I'm going to do my best to convey how things were when I wrote this and how things are now. COVID obviously didn't exist almost 5 years ago when we had the idea to build this boat. Even when it took an entire year to get all the contracts together and completely nail down the spec sheet, we weren't in a rush as the thought of a global pandemic had never crossed anyone's mind. It wasn't until all the contracts were signed and we were planning a small trip to the USVI to experience our first sail aboard an HH yacht, and there was the first mention of COVID. At the end of February 2020, we booked our flights to spend 4 nights on HH 6604 Flash, with a return date of March 8th, 2019. Jamie, being the cautious one, agreed to go on the trip but flew wearing an N95 mask. I think we saw maybe 2 other people traveling like this, and everyone looked at her like she was crazy. This changed entirely when we arrived back in Grand Cayman. On March 13th, all public gatherings were banned and all schools and offices were closed. On March 22nd, all of our airports shut down and borders were officially closed. And on March 24th, we entered our first lockdown. When I wrote this in September of 2021, we were living on a COVID-free island with the ability to gather and move about as we pleased. But 19 months later, our borders were still closed, and aside from an emergency, we couldn't leave. If you've been watching the last few episodes, the borders have been open for some time, and you know that I've just been to China in the spring of 2023. Things were still changing in China while I was there, and this May, 2 months ago, is the first time since 2020 that China has been opened back up to tourists and visa holders. We were safe on our island during the early days of COVID, but things looked a lot different for the folks at HH. During the mid to end of January 2020, HH's factory, along with the rest of China, started its break for Chinese New Year. Here's a fun fact. Chinese New Year is the single largest mammal migration on the planet, with everybody traveling from large cities back to their hometowns and villages to spend the 10-day holiday with their family. It was during this time with so many people traveling so closely together that instances of the coronavirus multiplied exponentially in China, and many people were prohibited from leaving their towns to travel back to work. On January 23rd, the Wuhan lockdown started, and in the following days, many other cities followed suit with the shutdowns that ultimately affected 56 million people. Paul Hakes was almost one of these 56 million. For those of you who don't know, Paul is in charge of construction, development, and all projects at HH Catamarans. You can find a link to my recent interview with him somewhere up here. Paul went home to New Zealand during Chinese New Year and arrived back something like 2 days before the borders had closed and China shut down. Even though Paul and many of the employees had made their way back, HH's factory was still required to remain closed. The Chinese government was not allowing any manufacturing companies to open unless they had been inspected and the necessary new protocols put into place. This was difficult because these new protocols were still being developed at the same time they were supposed to be implemented, and no one really knew what, if anything, was going to be the most effective way to keep people safe. Finally, HH Catamarans was able to get the inspection they needed and implement all the new protocols, and impressively, they did it with the need to issue only a 10-day construction delay in accordance with our build contract. That was all settled in March of 2020. At that point, nobody knew what was going to happen in the next month, let alone the next year. But with the employees safely back at HH's factory campus, construction continued pretty much as normal. As an aside, our project has managed to stay on schedule fairly well, something that has spanned multiple years. To date, the overall delay is 82 days over 4.5 years. 45 strictly relate to COVID, and the other 37 from VOs. That's pretty good. As construction progressed, one issue became very apparent to us: the interior. How would we be able to properly choose the finishes without being able to see, feel, and experience them? On top of this, COVID meant that we could not even get to China to see what the space inside the yacht was actually like and how we might want to finish it. There was really only one solution: have the 3D modeling far enough along to identify enough of the surfaces in order to create elevations of every single one of them. From there, we would have to order samples of the materials that we were interested in. Finally, once we had the elevations and the samples, we could actually start making the necessary decisions regarding our interior finishes. Simple concept that unfortunately didn't have quite as simple of an execution, but we got there in the end. HH went ahead and prepared as many of the elevations as they could. As of July 2021, we had signed off on 46 sheets of elevations. Here are what some of these elevations look like. Here we have part of the masthead and the splitting queen bunk, and then this is the outboard side of the galley. So take a good look at this one here, and here's what it translated into. Do you pick up the same elements? I think they did a great job. We since then have also signed off on the elevations for the complete fry bridge, both interior and exterior, and the aft cockpit. As owners, we do feel like we missed out on some of the really exciting parts with regards to this process. It would have been a great experience to be at the yard in person to see the layout of the yacht and browse the different veneers and fabrics that HH had available to them from their various suppliers, rather than trying to pick what we thought we were interested in from images online. Unfortunately, we are all victims of circumstance here. Aside from a quick turnaround on their drawings, the main thing HH did was to take a very proactive approach in regard to ordering their materials. Understanding the disruption in the global supply chains, HH ordered some of our equipment months in advance of when they would normally order it for a project going on during pre-COVID times. Some of that equipment was our spars, our mast, boom, longeron, which all came from Marstrom in Sweden. Yep, no small expense there. Another question is, what did we have to do differently as clients? It's a good question. First off, we understood ordering was going to be an issue and agreed to work with HH as far as making our milestone payments a little earlier than we were contractually obligated to. We managed to make most of our interior decisions via virtual tours and the 3D rendering process that I mentioned before. So here's the elevation that turned into this rendering here, and here's the final constructed result. I think they line up pretty well for computer images. When I did a whole episode on this process, linked here, I had no idea how reliant we would be on this process to finalize our interior. Normally in a build like this, I would have been back and forth to actually see the construction progress at least a couple of times over the last 2 years, minimally at every milestone, and then both Jamie and I would have flown over to do all the interior finishing selection. That trip alone could have been 2 to 3 weeks. But in 2021, when I first started thinking about this, there was still a 3-week quarantine in China, regardless of your vaccination status. And up until October of 2021, there was a mandatory 2-week quarantine for all travelers that I would have had to do upon returning to Grand Cayman. The combination of these two just made any trip to China unrealistic, not to mention the slim to nothing chance of getting a travel visa. All of this meant that both HH and Jamie and I had to be extremely flexible in terms of our meetings. There were a lot of late nights for us and early mornings for Paul and the rest of the HH team in order for us to try and stay on the same page and keep such a big project moving smoothly while navigating a 13-hour time difference. Video calls became very important as well, and there was even one Sunday night/morning where we were given a 2 a.m. for us tour of a granite warehouse, and we had to make our final selections for the boat at this time. It was quite the experience. Sketch to See as a channel also felt the squeeze from COVID. I had envisioned going to China and taking the viewer through the build process in a much different way. Up until recently, I had not been able to do the construction updates that I wanted to do in person. I have not been able to interview any of the key personnel that I wanted to. And again, I have never once seen our boat in person. At the end of the day, we all adapted. The lockdowns and travel bans were temporary and, in our opinions, a worthwhile precaution. Everybody went through their own COVID-related problems, and I know a lot of them were much more difficult than mine. I just wanted to give you a bit of insight into how the pandemic has affected our long-distance construction process, and our project in particular. I hope you enjoyed that episode. It feels good to be getting caught up on some content. If you have not already, please like, subscribe, and share. A little click from you goes a long way for us. Please follow our build a little closer on Instagram and Facebook. If you have any questions or just want to talk about boats, please reach out to me at sketchtosee@gmail.com. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.